So I really don't have that much more to say. So to recall, we looked at the laws of nature and that there are assumptions in that which are really a leap of faith in their own way, that there needs to be a cause for these that we should acknowledge, and that cause then indeed we assume thus the best possible solution for all these equations. And that implies you must have then a God who is omnipotent, who knows these solutions, who is omniscient, a God who is benevolent enough to do it. And if that is so, then as I said, the 17th century was still very much aware of that. So Newton taking that to be a proof of the existence of God. And I said that in the 18th century that begins to shift, and there's a famous story people like to tell about the physicist Laplace, who was visited by Napoleon, and Napoleon looked at his model of the world and so forth, and asked, well, where is God in your model? So, and he says, well, I do not have any need of that hypothesis, he said. So if that's right what I just said, then he is wrong. But not only is he wrong, this very statement is self-contradictory. If you say, I do not have need of God as a hypothesis, that is actually self-contradiction. How so? If you say, I do not have need of something, then you mean, I have a solution that is very economic and simple, and that's what I need to follow. It is a principle of parsimony. Also known as Occam's razor. So Occam was a Franciscan, not a Dominican, but he was a nominalist. So he thought, you shouldn't assume any entities beyond what is necessary. Right? So only the minimum amount of assumptions should be allowed. And people like Laplace and others to the present day will take that to mean we don't need God, so we just scratch that hypothesis, basically. But what I had said earlier was to assume that there is something elegant and economic and parsimonious in the universe is itself a theological assumption. Why would you assume that the universe operates in that way unless you assume it is made by a God who knows the best possible and most elegant and most beautiful solution to the problem, best form of order, and is willing to do that too, and able to do it. So you cannot use Occam's razor against God because you have to believe in God to believe in Occam's razor. Right? Most people don't realize that, but the earlier theologians were still aware of that. And so in that sense I say, if Laplace says, I do not have any need of that hypothesis, that is actually a self-contradiction. It's not only simply wrong, it is a self-contradiction. So that's basically my claim, and it summarizes that in a way. And as I said earlier, this is natural theology in the sense that it's not a particular faith claim. It doesn't appeal to particular forms of revelation, to the Bible, to the incarnation. It could be held by Muslims and Jews and by pagans like Aristotle. But if we come to see that, and if we come to see that what we do in science based on that actually works, and it seems to match how reality is, right? Then we should also expect that such a God would be so benevolent to intervene in reality and reveal himself if there is a need for us. He is making this beautiful universe for us so that we can understand it, apparently. Right? So if there's something that we are in need of, would he not also become incarnate to help us in that situation? So if you start from natural theology and you spell out the likelihood of these things and the presuppositions you already have, the possibility to accept that God would become incarnate, that he would save us, that he would come for our sake, that he would redeem us, is much higher. You don't start from scratch, and it's not irrational to believe that. It is actually within what we would expect. So, and from there I could go on and talk more about faith and reason and so forth in that sense, but that wasn't my topic. My topic was that there is another kind of faith, not in revelation, but another kind of faith that even science embodies in its very procedures. And so here's where I'm going to stop, and I'll have you ask questions, and we can go into more details when you want.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is modern science, the structure of modern science is built on the foundation of these axioms, right? That in the sense that there's a God who's benevolent, he's omniscient, and all these types of things that you laid out for us. If we had Dawkins or one of these other guys up here sitting next to you, what would he say to you? And what would you retort back?
I would hope he would say that, I've never thought of that. Which I'm pretty sure he hasn't.
So really, so this is just these are people who are just ignorant of their own kind of axioms then?
Well, as I said, I mean, I wouldn't put the finger in the face and say you're stupid and ignorant. It's more like, as what I said earlier, it's like the fish that doesn't know that he's wet. Because these are basic things we all assume without reflecting on it. And that it's the job of the philosopher to take what is self-understood and show that it is not self-understood. And the example I had, is you just trust that in the next moment the law of gravity is still in place, and you're not dropping to the ceiling and crashing your head or something like that. We don't live in that anxiety all the time. We live with a basic trust in God. That's without even acknowledging it. That is implied in that. So that's what I would say. I wouldn't say there are these, we call it axioms, that they operate from. Well, no, it's sort of embedded, it's assumed but not acknowledged. Not in a malicious way, I just don't.
So am I to interpret what you said to mean that our job is to make sure atheists understand that they're all wet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wet behind the ears. Yes.
Have you seen the animated children's movie Soul, Father? Okay. For anybody who hasn't seen it yet, there are these mathematical realities in physics. I can't remember exactly what they called them, but they were basically like the active agents who were applying mathematical principles. It's really quite an interesting reflection on, the order of the universe. Of course, his soul leaves his body and it kind of gets into the realm of the afterlife. But anyways, it gives, it basically anthropomorphizes or gives human form to these mathematical principles and makes them as though they're active agents directing the universe. So that kind of leads into my question. So in a sense, they're acknowledging what you're saying, and that there has to also be an active agent. They're just identifying it as the mathematical principles themselves. What would you say to somebody who said that I accept that there must be some kind of agency, I'm just not willing to accept that it is the Christian God. It's just some kind of scientific agency that we just have not yet discovered. Sometimes people point to aliens or paranormal or things such as that as an example.
So let me say first, by way of clarification, that I think I did speak a little bit as if that were proof of the existence of God. But I mean it first of all to point out that scientists have these assumptions that would point to God. It could still be that all these scientists are wrong with these assumptions. Right? I don't have that here, but I could give you some quotes, from people who may not believe that, like William James has something, Nietzsche and others. But that is pretty far an extreme position to take. And again, it's not what we do even just when we get on a plane. And apparently, the science that we have works pretty well. And any time the plane doesn't crash is evidence for the existence of God. Right? So you can, at the end, turn that into proof of the existence of God. For me, it was more important to show the scientist that he actually has such assumptions, that he's wet.
Sure.
Now, that having been said, the assumption would not be that this is just mathematical equations. And I try to say that equations themselves don't cause anything. So the question is still, why do things behave that way? Laws of nature are not entities that force things to do certain things. Right? They're first of all what we use to describe what we see in the behavior of physical particles and so on. And therefore, they are our descriptions, they're not the explanations for why that happens. How else would mathematical entities exist? Plato might think that it's a realm of its own, the realm of ideas, which is hardly anybody would assume that today, and especially not atheists, because they tend to be materialists, and that is not a material realm, it's a spiritual realm. So if not, then what would it be? And as I said, even Plato has problems explaining why these ideas have an impact on reality, why do they have the imprint, on how things operate. They themselves don't do anything. Aristotle made that objection, and I said Plato in some way implied that's true because he was the demiurge doing that and applying them. So mathematical equations just don't have agency that way. They also, if they are not like what Plato assumed, would be part of the physical universe. I don't even know what that would mean. First of all, if they were part of the universe, they are not a good candidate for that cause, because I said the cause that organizes all the other causes and the interactions is not one of them, it's outside of them. It's a transcendent cause. If it is part of the physical realm, it wouldn't be that. But mathematics are also universal truth. 2 plus 2 is always and everywhere true. It's not just in a particular place. If 2 plus 2 is 4, it's just another feature in the material physical world. It would be somewhere, right? It would be a particular thing. It would not be universal idea. So to me, that just doesn't make sense. That it's not intelligible really what that means. That mathematical entities would be part of that.
So why would it have to be outside? Why couldn't it be identified? You might say pantheism would be some of that, in that it actually identifies the universe as the active agent. What is the argument for why it cannot be?
So if the pantheist would say that the universe is God, and the question is there even a difference by saying God doesn't exist, just the universe exists. So for the purpose of explaining why this whole entity has these features, I think you would still need to have to go beyond that. Now, with pantheism, I would say there are lots of other questions to be raised. Can that really be God? Can God have parts? Can God evolve? Who makes him evolve? There are strange metaphysical questions that pantheists never can answer. Is an absolute that is in the process of becoming, that's in a way self-contradiction. It isn't an absolute that has to do that. And again, who brings it to that point? So a pot does not start to boil on its own, and you apply some source of energy to it. So there are lots of metaphysical questions to be raised that wouldn't exactly pertain to the ones that I have raised here. So, but even so, the universe is everything, which basically is what pantheists would say. You would still have that question: what makes them be that way? There's only one other possibility that people may raise, but it's interesting that really nobody does, to say that there's only one possible way in which things can be, and there just are these equations. Right? But these are obviously very particular equations that could very well be otherwise. The laws of nature could be otherwise. There could be different possible worlds in which maybe E equals mc the cube or something like that. So the universe is not logically necessary. It's not like 2 plus 2 is 4, which is true in every universe. laws of nature are not of that sort. They could be otherwise, and even atheists acknowledge that. So it's interesting that nobody even raises that as an objection.
Why is that objection, that they couldn't be otherwise? Why is that not an example of Occam's razor? Because it does seem simpler to say that it just is that way. And but is that why does that not suffice?
So the simplicity, as I said, is already a theological assumption, right? I mean, to say that that is a simpler assumption is not an argument against God, but presupposes God. And whether it is simpler also depends on whether that really explains why it is. So, I mean, if there is more than one possible set of laws of nature, you still have to explain why this and not another one, and why the most elegant and not just any one. So I don't think that makes the question go away, and therefore you cannot just cut off with Occam's razor at that point.
So there's always this assumption of simplicity, which you see that in medieval theology as an aspect of God. And
Yes. This is.
would you say in the development of what you might call modernity or mechanical philosophy or Enlightenment philosophy, there is still that element of simplicity assumed in the way that things cause one another? And
Yes.
how does philosophy today keep from making the same mistakes as that kind of philosophy? Or is that a false dichotomy that I'm drawing?
What mistake do you mean? No.
Of assuming that there's only one kind of causality, and that's mechanical. We can, in principle, observe it.
Not exactly sure that I got your question, but let me say what I did hear you say, or how I could respond. I mean, so the question of simplicity. So simplicity of equations, so forth. Yes, you can also say, in some way it reflects the very simplicity of God himself. And Richard Swinburne, it's a famous philosopher of religion, argues from the simplicity that science assumes to say God is the best explanation for that. My argument is actually the reverse. The simplicity that Swinburne argues from already is a theological assumption, not the other way around. But it is connected to the very simplicity of God, indeed, I think. Now, the other thing you said about mechanical causes, it's a different question, I think. I mean, you are thinking of the modern reduction to this just one kind of cause, right?
Or maybe biological reduction of the kind that Dawkins seems to favor.
Right. So reductionism, is this reductionism? That was almost equivocating a bit. I think it's rather different. It's to think that something is very beautiful and elegant is not a reduction. That's actually a pretty massive assumption, I thought. Reduction is rather to say we don't need that, and maybe the universe is just chaotic, and we scrape by, what we can see and observe, which is not mathematical laws. So now the mechanical causes are indeed connected to the mathematical laws that are used as a starting point. So that does emerge in the 17th century. The Middle Ages didn't really use these. And I would say, and that would be a longer talk, that this is indeed one of the paradigms, and every age has a kind of a paradigm to make the universe intelligible. And it's always something that orders things in an economic kind of way. It uses something like principles of parsimony. And Ptolemy had his own way of doing that, and maybe just didn't work as well. The Middle Ages looked at things forms of classification, species and subspecies and individuals underneath these, and had various ways of, indeed classifying reality. And so there would be more to be said about that, which I cannot get into right now, but my claim though would be that we always do that. That we always have some kind of theological assumption. And to live without that is virtually impossible. Even Nietzsche couldn't do that, even though he talks that way. And that's not a reduction. I think that's just, it's a theological assumption, not a reduction.
I noticed in your talk you were referring to a number of physicists and physicists, philosophers, and so forth, and bringing out what was useful from the information and what was in conflict. And I was just thinking, coming from a biological background, I read Intelligent Design, and I just thought it was so convincing. And I finally realized it's like people that don't agree with it don't read it. They just won't look at it at all. They just don't take that attitude and I'll look at other people and see what's good and what isn't.
Now, there are many people who are negative about Michael Behe. I'm not so negative about that. I think it's a case that needs to be made. And so there's the thing with the irreducible complexity. I mean, you cannot have a car, without having all the wheels and whistles going with it. Only then does it have the survival value that makes it survive, sort of by analogy in the natural world. And so that cannot come about randomly just by one mutation. The whole complex kind of thing coming about all at once. So that's basically the argument. I wouldn't put all my money on these arguments because these are basically empirical questions, and there are cases where people think they have figured out ways in which that can develop gradually. For example, the evolution of the eye. And sometimes people, well-meaning people quote Darwin to say that's irreducible, but in context, Darwin says no, it can actually be shown. So that's not a good quote.
Because he wasn't looking at it on a molecular level, or a protein level, because the complexity of the mechanisms that are involved in making any of these things work, they're so complex they couldn't come about just by accident. And because the intermediates are useless, and so they would die because, or they'd be killed or whatever in nature. And so it wouldn't survive. It's one thing to, and they've since found that a lot of the genes have like two different morphs, like the moths that he saw that were dark or white. Well, it turns out that that's in genetic coding, and they actually take just one small change to have that, but that system is already set up. See, so what he was thinking was development was actually just a response that was already built into the creature.
No, I think there's a lot to be said for that, and